It was the night of March 27, 1988, and the air inside Madison Square Garden carried a weight that 20,000 people could feel pressing against their chests. New York City had seen countless legendary performances within these storied walls, but something about this particular evening felt different from the moment the first fans began filing through the entrances hours before the show was scheduled to begin. The Bad World Tour had already become the most ambitious concert production in music history, but tonight, whispers were circulating through the crowd that something unprecedented was about to happen. No one knew exactly what, but the energy building inside the arena suggested that history was preparing to write itself in ways no one could predict. The stage itself was a monument to ambition, a sprawling construction of steel and light that seemed to breathe with anticipation. Technicians moved through the shadows, making final adjustments to equipment that would soon channel the voice of a man who had transcended the boundaries of what any single performer could achieve. The lighting rigs hung overhead like constellations waiting to be born, each bulb precisely positioned to capture every movement, every gesture, every moment of connection between Michael Jackson and the sea of humanity that had gathered to witness him. Giant screens flanked the main stage, currently dark but soon to display images that would sear themselves into the collective memory of everyone present. In the front rows, fans who had camped outside for days clutched their tickets like sacred relics, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and electric anticipation. Some wore single white gloves. Others had meticulously recreated the military jackets and silver buckles that had become synonymous with Michael's visual identity. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, their eyes wide with the knowledge that they were about to see someone their generation would speak of for the rest of their lives. Elderly couples held hands, remembering a young boy from Gary, Indiana, who had first captured their hearts decades earlier and who had somehow continued to evolve, to grow, to become something that seemed to exist beyond the normal limitations of human artistry. The lights inside the arena dimmed slowly, and the effect was immediate. 20,000 voices fell silent in a wave that swept from the front rows to the highest balconies, as if the entire building had collectively held its breath. The darkness was complete for 3 heartbeats, maybe 4, and in that silence you could hear the soft rustle of programs being lowered, the subtle shift of bodies leaning forward, the almost imperceptible whisper of anticipation that seemed to rise from the very floor itself. This was the moment before the moment, the sacred pause that separated ordinary life from the transcendent experience that was about to unfold. Then came the sound. It began as a low rumble, a bass frequency that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears, and it grew steadily, building like a wave approaching shore, until it seemed to fill every molecule of air inside Madison Square Garden. Lights exploded across the stage in patterns of white and gold, and suddenly, there he was, rising from beneath the stage on a platform that seemed to materialize from pure energy. Michael Jackson stood motionless for a full 5 seconds, his silhouette backlit by a wall of pure white light, his fedora tilted at precisely the angle that had graced 1,000 magazine covers, his military jacket gleaming with gold and silver accents that caught the light like armor forged for a king. The crowd erupted with a force that seemed capable of lifting the roof from its foundations. 20,000 voices merged into a single sustained roar that washed over the stage in waves of pure adoration. People wept openly, their tears catching the light as they streamed down faces frozen in expressions of disbelief and joy. Hands reached toward the stage as if trying to touch something holy, and the sound of their combined voices created a wall of love so tangible that those who were there would later describe it as something they could physically feel pressing against their skin. Michael remained still through the first wave of screaming, allowing the moment to build, to crest, to reach its natural peak before he would begin to move. This was something he had learned in the thousands of performances that had come before, that the anticipation was itself a gift he could give to his audience, a moment of pure potential energy before the kinetic explosion that would follow. His eyes were closed behind the shadow of his fedora, and those close enough to see his face would later remember that his lips moved slightly, as if he were saying a silent prayer, as if he were gathering something from deep within himself that he was about to share with everyone present. The first notes of the opening song pierced through the screaming, and Michael's body responded as if the music were electricity flowing directly through his nervous system. His right foot slid backward across the stage in a movement so smooth it seemed to defy the laws of physics, and his left hand rose to grasp the microphone stand with a grip that was both delicate and powerful. When he began to sing, his voice cut through the wall of sound from the audience like a laser through fog, each note perfectly placed, each word carrying the weight of decades of training and natural gift combined into something that transcended technique and became pure expression. The first 3 songs passed in a blur of movement and light and sound, each one building on the one before, each one pushing the energy in the arena higher and higher until it seemed impossible that the atmosphere could become any more charged. Dancers moved around Michael in perfectly choreographed patterns, their movements both supporting and framing the central figure, who seemed to exist in a slightly different dimension than everyone else on stage. The lighting shifted constantly, creating moments of dramatic shadow and explosive brightness that turned the stage into a canvas on which stories were being painted in real time. It was during the transition after the 3rd song that the first unusual thing happened. The music faded, and the dancers retreated to the wings, leaving Michael alone at center stage in a pool of soft blue light. This was normally the moment when he would address the crowd directly, speaking to them in that gentle, almost shy voice that seemed so different from the powerful instrument he used when singing. But tonight, instead of speaking, Michael tilted his head slightly, as if he were listening to something that no one else could hear. The crowd, sensing that something unexpected was happening, fell into a hush that spread through the arena like ripples across still water. 20,000 people waited, their eyes fixed on the lone figure on stage, their breathing synchronized in collective anticipation. Michael's hand rose to his ear, a gesture that seemed almost involuntary, as if he were straining to hear a distant sound. Then, slowly, a smile began to spread across his face, a smile that those who knew him well would later describe as mischievous, as if he were a child who knew a secret he was about to share. From the left side of the stage, a new sound began to emerge, a guitar riff that seemed to materialize from nowhere, notes cascading through the speakers in a pattern that was unmistakably familiar to anyone who had followed popular music in the previous decade. The crowd began to stir, a murmur building as people turned to each other with expressions of confusion and dawning recognition. The guitar sound grew louder, more insistent, and then, stepping out of the shadows and into a spotlight of his own, came a figure that made the audience gasp as one. Prince Rogers Nelson walked toward center stage with a confidence that seemed to bend the very light around him, his purple sequined outfit catching the spotlights and throwing fragments of color across the stage like a human disco ball. His guitar, the famous cloud guitar that had become as much a part of his identity as Michael's glove, hung from his shoulders as he played, his fingers moving across the fretboard with the fluid precision of someone for whom the instrument was merely an extension of his own body. He was smaller than many had expected, barely reaching Michael's shoulder in height, but his presence filled the stage with an intensity that seemed to match and even challenge the energy that Michael himself projected. The crowd's reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. If their initial response to Michael's appearance had been a wave, this was a tsunami. People screamed, cried, grabbed each other in disbelief, and pointed at the stage as if witnessing a miracle. The 2 biggest stars in popular music, the 2 artists whose rivalry had defined the 1980s, whose fans had been divided into passionate camps that seemed irreconcilable, were now standing on the same stage, looking at each other across a distance of maybe 10 feet. Michael stood motionless as Prince approached, his face unreadable behind the shadow of his fedora. Those who knew him well could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the almost imperceptible set of his jaw that indicated he was processing information rapidly, adapting to a situation that even he had not fully anticipated. The world had spent years speculating about what would happen if these 2 ever met on stage, whether their professional respect would overcome their competitive instincts, whether the electricity between them would be creative or destructive. Prince stopped playing when he reached the center of the stage, and for a moment, the 2 men simply looked at each other in silence. The crowd had fallen quiet again, sensing that they were witnessing something that transcended entertainment, something that felt more like a summit between heads of state than a concert. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to taste, and those in the front rows could see both men's chests rising and falling with controlled breathing. When Prince finally spoke, his voice carried through the arena with the help of a wireless microphone that seemed to appear in his hand as if by magic. His words were not what anyone expected. Instead of a greeting, instead of the diplomatic pleasantries that the situation seemed to demand, Prince issued a challenge that made the audience gasp. He said that he had watched Michael perform many times, that he had studied his movements, his technique, his artistry, and that he believed it was time for the world to see which of them truly deserved to be called the greatest performer of their generation. He said he was challenging Michael Jackson, right here, right now, in front of 20,000 witnesses, to prove that he was worthy of the crown that the world had placed upon his head. The silence that followed was unlike anything Madison Square Garden had ever contained. You could hear the hum of the electrical equipment, the soft whisper of the air conditioning, the almost subliminal sound of 20,000 hearts beating in anticipation. All eyes were on Michael, whose face remained hidden in shadow, whose body remained perfectly still, whose very silence seemed to be a statement in itself. Years later, those who were there would describe this moment as the longest of their lives, each second stretching into what felt like minutes, as they waited to see how the king of pop would respond to this unprecedented challenge. When Michael finally moved, it was with a slowness that suggested complete and utter control. His right hand rose to the brim of his fedora, and with a gesture that was both casual and loaded with meaning, he tilted the hat back just enough to reveal his eyes. Those eyes, dark and deep and somehow ancient despite the youth of the face that contained them, fixed on Prince with an expression that contained no anger, no defensiveness, no fear. Instead, there was something that looked almost like amusement, as if Michael were a parent watching a child attempt something adorable but futile. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, almost gentle, a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the arena through the microphone that had been placed on his collar. He said just two words that would be replayed millions of times in the years that followed, 2 words that would become legendary in the annals of music history. He said, "Follow me." And then, without waiting for a response, without looking to see if Prince would accept the invitation, Michael Jackson turned his back on his challenger and began to move. What happened next would be described by those who witnessed it as the single most extraordinary display of performance ability ever seen on a concert stage. Michael began with a simple walk toward the back of the stage, but even in this basic movement, there was something extraordinary, a fluidity, a grace, a sense that each step was a carefully composed piece of art. His hips swayed with a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the music itself, and his shoulders rolled in counterpoint, creating a visual melody that mirrored and enhanced the audio experience. Then the music began, emerging from the speakers like a living thing, a bass line so powerful that you could feel it in your bones, accompanied by a drum pattern that seemed to synchronize with every heartbeat in the building. Michael reached the back of the stage and turned, and when he did, the transformation was complete. He was no longer simply a man standing on a stage. He was something else entirely, something that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of time and space, something that channeled pure creative energy through a human form. He began to dance, and the world stopped. His feet moved in patterns that seemed physically impossible, sliding and spinning and pivoting with a precision that made the movements look effortless even as they defied everything that audiences thought they understood about the limitations of the human body. His arms carved through the air in arcs that traced invisible sculptures, and his head snapped from position to position with the mechanical precision of a robot combined with the organic fluidity of water. Every muscle in his body seemed to be independently controlled yet perfectly coordinated, creating a symphony of movement that was as complex and beautiful as any orchestra. Prince, who had remained near the center of the stage, began to play his guitar again, trying to insert himself into the moment, trying to reclaim some of the attention that had completely shifted to his rival. His playing was extraordinary, technically brilliant, filled with the virtuosity that had made him famous. But something strange was happening. Instead of competing with Michael's dance, Prince's guitar seemed to be responding to it, following the movements, providing a soundtrack that enhanced rather than challenged what was happening on the other side of the stage. Michael moved across the stage like a force of nature, and with each step, each spin, each impossible freeze and release, he seemed to be drawing Prince's music into his own orbit. It was as if the challenge that had been issued was being answered not with aggression but with invitation, not with competition but with collaboration. Michael danced toward Prince, his movements becoming more intricate, more demanding, and Prince responded by playing faster, more intensely, his fingers flying across the strings in patterns that matched and mirrored the choreography unfolding before him. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. This was not the battle they had expected. This was something else entirely, something that transcended rivalry and competition, something that revealed a truth about artistry that few had ever witnessed so directly. Two masters, two undisputed geniuses of their craft, were not fighting for dominance but were instead engaged in a conversation, a dialogue conducted in the language of music and movement that seemed to erase all the petty conflicts that had been projected onto them by the outside world. Michael reached Prince and stopped directly in front of him, their faces inches apart, the smaller man looking up at the taller one with an expression that had shifted from competitive confidence to something approaching wonder. Michael's chest was heaving slightly from the exertion of his dance, a thin sheen of sweat visible on his forehead, but his eyes were clear and focused, locked onto Prince's with an intensity that seemed to communicate volumes without a single word being spoken. If this story is moving you, if you are feeling the power of what happened that night in Madison Square Garden, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories like this one, so many moments from Michael's extraordinary life that deserve to be told, and your support makes it possible for us to continue sharing them with the world. For a long moment, the two men simply stood there, looking at each other, and then something remarkable happened. Prince's guitar playing softened, becoming gentle, almost tentative, and his free hand reached up to remove the purple headband that had become one of his signature accessories. He held it out toward Michael, an offering, a gesture of recognition that spoke louder than any words could have. Michael looked at the headband, then at Prince, and a smile spread across his face that transformed his features from those of a fierce competitor to those of a generous friend. Michael reached up and removed his own fedora, the famous hat that had accompanied him through countless performances, through years of evolution as an artist, through all the triumphs and tribulations that had defined his career. He held it out toward Prince, and for a heartbeat, the two men stood there with their offerings extended, frozen in a tableau that seemed to capture something essential about the nature of artistic greatness. Then, simultaneously, they exchanged their signature items, Prince placing Michael's fedora on his own head, Michael tying Prince's headband around his wrist like a bracelet of brotherhood. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, erupted into the loudest sustained roar that Madison Square Garden had ever contained. People wept openly, hugged strangers, threw their arms in the air in celebration of what they were witnessing. This was not just a concert anymore. This was a moment of healing, a demonstration that even the fiercest rivalries could give way to mutual respect and understanding, a reminder that greatness recognizes greatness, and that the truest mark of a champion is the ability to celebrate the excellence of others. But the night was far from over. Michael raised his hand, calling for quiet, and such was his command over the audience that the screaming subsided within seconds, replaced by an anticipatory silence that hummed with electric potential. He looked at Prince, tilted his head in that curious, bird-like gesture that had become one of his trademarks, and asked a question that made the smaller man's eyes widen with surprise. Michael asked if Prince would like to see something that he had never shown anyone before, something that he had been working on in private, something that he had been saving for a moment that felt worthy of its revelation. Prince nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of curiosity and something that looked almost like reverence. He took a step back, creating space at the center of the stage, and Michael moved to fill it with the fluid grace of water flowing into an empty vessel. The lights in the arena dimmed until only a single spotlight remained, a beam of pure white that illuminated Michael from above like a divine visitation, leaving everything else in shadow. The music that began to play was unlike anything the audience had heard before. It started with a simple piano melody, gentle and almost fragile, notes falling like raindrops on still water. Then strings joined, swelling underneath the piano, adding depth and emotion to the simple foundation. The tempo was slow, almost funereal, but there was something in the music that suggested not death but transformation, not ending but beginning, Not loss, but the discovery of something precious that had been hidden. Michael began to move, but these were not the sharp, precise movements that had defined his earlier dancing. These were slower, more fluid, more expressive, as if his body were translating emotions directly into physical form without the intermediary of choreography. His arms rose and fell like the wings of a bird preparing to take flight. His torso swayed like a tree in a gentle wind, and his face, usually hidden behind the mask of performance, became open and vulnerable in a way that made many in the audience feel they were seeing the real Michael Jackson for the first time. As the music built, Michael's movements became more intense, more demanding, pushing his body to limits that seemed impossible. He spun in circles so fast that he became a blur, then stopped with such precision that it seemed like time itself had frozen. He dropped to his knees and rose again with the grace of a dancer and the power of an athlete, and through it all, his face remained open, emotional, as if he were channeling something from deep within himself that had been waiting for this moment to be expressed. The audience watched in absolute silence, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sound might break the spell that had been cast over Madison Square Garden. Some covered their mouths with their hands, tears streaming down their cheeks, overwhelmed by the raw beauty of what they were witnessing. Others sat with their eyes closed, letting the music and the sense of movement wash over them, experiencing the performance through some combination of sound and collective energy that transcended the visual. Prince, who had retreated to the side of the stage, stood motionless with his guitar hanging forgotten at his side. His face, usually a mask of cool confidence, showed an expression of unguarded awe that would be captured by photographers and would appear on the covers of magazines around the world in the weeks that followed. In that moment, all pretense of competition had been stripped away, replaced by the simple recognition of witnessing something that transcended normal human ability, something that approached the miraculous. The dance lasted for perhaps 5 minutes, though those who were there would later say it felt both like an instant and an eternity. When it finally ended, when Michael's body came to rest in a pose that seemed to capture all the emotion of the performance in a single frozen moment, the silence continued for several heartbeats. And then, beginning in the front rows and spreading like wildfire through the arena, the applause began. It was not just clapping, not just cheering, but something more primal, a release of emotion that had been building throughout the performance and could no longer be contained. People rose to their feet as one, 20,000 bodies standing in tribute to what they had witnessed. The applause seemed to go on forever, wave after wave of appreciation and love washing over the stage, and Michael stood in the center of it all with his head bowed, his chest heaving, his face hidden in shadow. When he finally raised his head, when the lights caught the tears that were streaming down his cheeks, the crowd's response somehow intensified, becoming not just appreciation for the performance but a shared emotional experience that connected every person in the building. Prince walked back toward the center of the stage, his steps slow and deliberate, his face still wearing that expression of awe that had transformed his features during Michael's solo performance. When he reached Michael, he did something that no one expected, something that would be talked about and debated and analyzed for decades to come. He dropped to one knee in front of Michael Jackson, bowed his head, and raised his guitar above him like an offering to a king. The symbolism was unmistakable and overwhelming. Prince, one of the most talented and confident performers of his generation, a man who had built his career on being the best, was publicly acknowledging Michael's supremacy. It was not a gesture of defeat but of recognition, not an admission of weakness but an acknowledgement of greatness. The crowd, already emotional, completely lost control, their screaming reaching a pitch that seemed capable of shattering glass. Michael looked down at the kneeling Prince, and for a moment, his face showed conflict, as if he were uncomfortable with the gesture, as if the competitive victory he had sought was not as satisfying as he had expected it to be. Then, in a movement that embodied everything that made Michael Jackson not just a great performer but a great human being, he reached down and took Prince's hand, pulling him gently to his feet. When Prince stood, Michael embraced him, wrapping his arms around the smaller man and holding him close while 20,000 people wept with joy. When they separated, Michael turned to face the audience, one arm still around Prince's shoulders, and spoke directly to the sea of faces before him. His voice was soft, intimate, as if he were having a private conversation with each person individually despite the thousands who were listening. He said that what they had witnessed was not a competition at all, that it had never been about proving who was better, that such comparisons were meaningless when applied to true artists. He said that Prince was one of the most extraordinary musicians he had ever encountered, that his talent was a gift to the world, and that he was honored to share a stage with him. Prince, visibly moved, spoke in response, his voice carrying the vulnerability that his performance persona rarely allowed to show. He said that he had come to the stage thinking he wanted to challenge, to compete, to prove something to himself and to the world. But what he had found instead was something infinitely more valuable. He said he had found a brother, a fellow traveler on the difficult road of artistic greatness, someone who understood the isolation and the pressure and the endless striving for perfection that defined their lives. He said that Michael had taught him something that night, something about generosity and grace that he would carry with him forever. The two men stood together at the center of the stage, arms around each other's shoulders, and the image they created would become one of the most iconic photographs in music history. Here were two artists who had been positioned by the media and by their fans as bitter rivals, standing together in genuine affection and mutual respect. Here was proof that competition need not be destructive, that greatness could recognize and celebrate greatness, that the petty jealousies that the world tried to impose on artists could be transcended by those with the vision to see past them. But the performance was not over. Michael and Prince exchanged a look that seemed to communicate entire conversations in a single glance, and then they turned back to face the audience with expressions that suggested more surprises were yet to come. Michael raised his hand, calling for quiet, and announced that they would like to perform something together, something that neither of them had ever done before, something that was being created in this moment, for this audience, never to be repeated in exactly the same way. The musicians in the pit, who had been waiting in confused anticipation, suddenly came to life as Michael began to sing a melody that no one had ever heard. It was beautiful and haunting, a simple tune that somehow contained within it echoes of every love song ever written while remaining utterly original. Prince listened for a moment, his head tilted, and then he began to play, his guitar finding harmonies and countermelodies that complemented and enhanced Michael's voice in ways that seemed almost supernatural. They began to move around each other as they performed, their bodies creating choreography in real time, each responding to the other's movements with an intuition that suggested they had been dancing together for years rather than minutes. Michael's voice soared and dipped, explored the upper reaches of his range, and then descended into intimate whispers, while Prince's guitar wove intricate patterns around and through the vocals, sometimes supporting, sometimes challenging, always in perfect dialogue. The song they created together lasted for nearly 10 minutes, and by the end of it, many in the audience were sitting in stunned silence, too overwhelmed to respond in any conventional way. What they had witnessed was not just a performance but an act of creation, two masters of their craft coming together to make something that neither could have made alone. When the final notes faded away and the last echoes disappeared into the rafters, the arena sat in perfect stillness for almost 30 seconds before the applause began. This time, the applause was different. It was not the explosive release of earlier ovations but something deeper, more sustained, more meaningful. People clapped slowly, rhythmically, in unison, as if they were performing their own piece of music in response to what they had experienced. The sound built gradually, becoming louder and more intense, until it reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of Madison Square Garden. Michael and Prince stood together at the center of the stage, their hands clasped between them, their faces wearing expressions of exhaustion and exhilaration that showed the full extent of what they had given to the audience. They bowed together, a single unified gesture that sealed their connection and their shared triumph. When they rose, they exchanged one final look, a look that contained gratitude and respect and something that might have been the beginning of genuine friendship. Prince raised his hand in farewell to the audience, brought Michael's hand, still clasped in his own, to his lips in a gesture of courtly respect, and then turned and walked toward the wings. As he walked, he reached up and removed Michael's fedora from his head, holding it carefully in both hands like a precious artifact. At the edge of the stage, he paused and looked back, holding the hat up as if to return it, but Michael shook his head and pointed at Prince, indicating that he should keep it. Prince's face broke into a smile so genuine and so full of joy that it transformed his entire appearance, making him look like a child who had received an unexpected gift. The image of Prince walking off stage wearing his own purple costume but carrying Michael Jackson's fedora would become one of the defining photographs of the 1980s, a visual symbol of an artistic reconciliation that had touched millions of hearts. In the years that followed, Prince would keep that fedora in a place of honor in his home, and in interviews he would always speak of that night as one of the most important of his career, not because of any victory he had won but because of the lesson he had learned about the true nature of greatness. Michael remained on stage after Prince's departure, and the show continued with performances of his most beloved songs. But everything that followed was colored by what had come before, elevated by the energy of the earlier encounter, infused with an emotional depth that made even the most familiar songs feel new and revelatory. The audience, having witnessed something truly extraordinary, responded to every moment with heightened appreciation, understanding that they were part of something that would never happen exactly this way again. During a quiet moment between songs, a small commotion began at the edge of the stage. Security guards were trying to contain someone, and Michael noticed the disturbance and walked toward it with the calm curiosity that characterized his approach to the unexpected. As he got closer, he could see that it was a child, a young girl of perhaps 8 or 9 years old, who had somehow made it past the barriers and was desperately trying to reach the stage. The child was clutching something in her hands, a piece of paper that she held out toward Michael with an intensity that seemed to contain her entire existence. Her face was streaked with tears, her small body trembling with emotion and effort, her voice lost in the cacophony of the crowd, but her lips clearly forming the words, "Please, please, please." Security was about to carry her away, to remove her from the stage area with the professional efficiency that characterized their work, when Michael raised his hand and everything stopped. He walked to the edge of the stage and knelt down, bringing himself to the child's eye level, and the arena fell silent with the suddenness of a switch being thrown. 20,000 people held their breath as the biggest star in the world knelt before a small child, his face soft with concern and curiosity, his attention completely focused on this tiny person who had risked everything to reach him. The security guards stood frozen, uncertain what to do, their training no match for the authority that Michael projected. Michael reached out his hand, and the child placed the piece of paper in his palm with the reverent care of someone handling a holy relic. He unfolded it slowly, and those close enough to see could tell that it was a letter, handwritten in the careful, uneven script of a child who was still learning to form her letters. Michael read silently, his lips moving slightly, his face changing expression as he absorbed whatever message the child had written. When he finished, he looked up at the little girl, and the tears that began to stream down his face told the audience everything they needed to know about the contents of that letter. Without saying a word, Michael stood and lifted the child onto the stage, cradling her in his arms with the tenderness of a parent. He carried her to the center of the spotlight, and the giant screens displayed the image of the world's biggest star holding a small girl who had somehow become, in this moment, the most important person in Madison Square Garden. The child buried her face in Michael's shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs, and Michael held her and rocked her gently, humming a melody that the microphones barely picked up, a lullaby that seemed to be just for her. When the child finally lifted her head, her face was transformed by joy, the earlier desperation replaced by a peace that seemed almost otherworldly. Michael set her down gently on the stage, keeping one hand on her shoulder, and addressed the audience in a voice that was thick with emotion. He said that this little girl had written to tell him that her mother was very sick, that the doctors had said there was not much hope, but that her mother's dying wish was to know that her daughter would be okay, would be loved, would be remembered. The audience responded with a wave of emotion that seemed to ripple through the arena in visible waves. People wept openly, reached for their companions, pressed their hands to their hearts as if to contain feelings too large to hold inside. Here was a reminder, in the midst of all the spectacle and glamour and larger-than-life performance, of the small human dramas that made up the fabric of ordinary life. Here was a child facing the impending loss of her mother, seeking comfort from a stranger who happened to be the most famous person in the world. Michael knelt beside the child again and spoke to her directly, though his words were amplified so that the entire arena could hear. He told her that her mother's love would never leave her, that love like that does not end with death but transforms into something else, something that stays with us forever. He told her that she was brave and strong and beautiful, and that her mother knew all of this and was proud of her beyond measure. He told her that he would remember her name, that he would think of her and send her strength whenever he performed, that she would never truly be alone because she was now part of his family too. Then Michael did something that made even the most cynical observers catch their breath. He reached up and removed the single white glove from his right hand, the most iconic accessory in popular music, the symbol that had become synonymous with his very identity. He took the child's small hand and slipped the glove onto it, adjusting it gently so that it would stay in place despite being many sizes too large. The child looked down at her hand, now adorned with Michael Jackson's glove, and her face showed an expression of wonder so pure that it seemed to illuminate the entire stage. Michael leaned close and whispered something in the child's ear, something that no microphone captured, something that remained forever a secret between the two of them. Whatever he said made the child smile through her tears, made her throw her arms around his neck in a fierce hug, made her nod with a determination that seemed to straighten her small spine and square her thin shoulders. When she finally released him, she stood on the stage with a new confidence, as if Michael's glove had transferred some of his magic to her, as if she had been given armor against the difficult times that lay ahead. Security guards, gentle now rather than officious, led the child back to her seat in the audience, where her father waited with an expression of gratitude so profound that it seemed to age his face even as it illuminated it with hope. The crowd parted to let them through, and as they passed, people reached out to touch the child, to share in the blessing she had received, to be part of the moment that had just unfolded before them. The child held her gloved hand high, and the white sequins caught the light and scattered it like a diamond, turning her into a small beacon of hope in the vast darkness of the arena. Michael watched until the child reached her seat, his face still wet with tears, his bare right hand looking somehow naked without its familiar covering. Then he turned back to face the audience and drew a deep breath that seemed to originate from his very core. When he spoke, his voice was steady but soft, carrying the weight of everything he had just experienced. He said that moments like this were why he did what he did, why he had dedicated his life to performance, why he pushed himself beyond all normal limits in pursuit of something that could touch people's hearts. He said that the music, the dancing, the spectacle, all of it was ultimately in service of connection, of creating moments where the barriers between people fell away and something real and human could pass between them. He said that the little girl had given him a gift far greater than any he could give her, the gift of being reminded why his work mattered, why the sacrifices were worth it, why he must continue to strive for perfection not for his own glory but for the people who needed what he could provide. The audience listened in rapt attention, many still wiping tears from their faces, all of them feeling the truth in his words resonating with their own experiences of the evening. They had come for entertainment, for spectacle, for the thrill of seeing a legend perform. They were leaving with something deeper, something that would stay with them long after the specific songs and dance moves had faded from memory. They were leaving with proof that human connection transcended fame and fortune, that compassion was more powerful than competition, that love could manifest itself in the most unexpected ways. The concert continued, but everything that followed was infused with the emotional depth of what had already occurred. When Michael performed his most famous songs, the audience sang along with a fervor that seemed to carry extra meaning. When he danced, people watched with an appreciation that went beyond admiring technique to embracing the full humanity of the man performing. When he spoke between songs, his words landed with increased weight, received by an audience that had seen past the celebrity to the person beneath. As the show neared its end, Michael gathered his dancers and band for a final number that built to a climax of sound and light and movement that seemed designed to permanently sear itself into the memories of everyone present. The stage erupted in pyrotechnics that spelled out messages of love and hope, and Michael's voice soared above it all, reaching notes that seemed impossible, sustaining them with a power that seemed to transcend physical limitation. When the final note faded and the last explosion of light settled into darkness, Michael stood alone at the center of the stage, his chest heaving, his body glistening with exertion, his face raised toward the ceiling as if in prayer or thanksgiving. The audience was on their feet, their applause a physical force that seemed capable of lifting the roof from the building. Their voices merged into a single sustained expression of love and gratitude and awe. Michael bowed deeply, his body folding at the waist until his head nearly touched the stage, remaining in that position of humility for several long seconds before rising again. He looked out at the sea of faces, the thousands of individual lives that had merged for a few hours into a single collective experience, and his face showed an emotion that transcended simple gratitude, that approached something like reverence for the power of human connection. He raised one hand, the right hand that was now bare of its glove, and waved slowly to the audience. It was a simple gesture, the universal symbol of farewell, but in the context of everything that had happened, it carried enormous weight. People waved back, many with tears still streaming down their faces, all of them understanding that they were part of something that would never be repeated, that would exist only in their memories and in the stories they would tell for the rest of their lives. As Michael turned to leave the stage, he paused and looked back over his shoulder one final time. The spotlights caught his face in profile, illuminating the features that had become among the most recognizable in the world, and for a moment, he seemed almost translucent, as if the light were passing through him rather than reflecting off him. Then he smiled, a smile so pure and unguarded that it transformed his face into something approaching angelic, and he walked into the wings and was gone. The audience remained standing for long minutes after his departure, reluctant to break the spell, unwilling to return to ordinary life after experiencing something so extraordinary. Slowly, gradually, people began to gather their things, to make their way toward the exits, to emerge from Madison Square Garden into a New York night that seemed somehow different than it had been when they entered. They walked in clusters, talking animatedly about what they had witnessed, comparing impressions, trying to put into words experiences that seemed to resist language. In the years that followed, the concert at Madison Square Garden on March 27, 1988, would be discussed and analyzed and debated by music historians and fans alike. The unexpected appearance of Prince, the challenge and the response, the creation of music that had never existed before and would never exist again in exactly that form, all of it would become legend. But for many who were there, the moment that stayed with them longest was not the Battle of the Titans but the encounter with the small girl, the giving of the glove, the demonstration that true greatness lies not in talent or fame but in the capacity for compassion. The little girl's name was Emily, and her story would become part of Michael Jackson's legacy in ways that no one could have predicted that night. Her mother did pass away, just 3 weeks after the concert, but Emily faced that loss with a strength that astonished everyone who knew her. She kept the glove in a special case beside her bed, and whenever the grief became too much, she would take it out and hold it and remember the words that Michael had whispered in her ear, words that remained her secret but that seemed to give her the power to go on. If this story has touched you, if you have felt the power of what happened that night in Madison Square Garden, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. By supporting us, you make it possible for us to continue telling these stories, to continue sharing the moments from Michael's life that reveal the extraordinary human being he was beneath the fame and the spectacle. Years later, Emily would grow up to become a music therapist, dedicating her life to using the healing power of music to help children facing difficult circumstances. She would often speak of the night that changed her life, the night when the biggest star in the world saw her, truly saw her, and responded with a kindness that transcended anything she could have imagined. The glove remained her most treasured possession, a talisman that connected her to a moment when she learned that even in the darkest times, kindness and love could appear in the most unexpected forms. Prince, too, was forever changed by that night. The fedora that Michael had given him became a symbol of the lesson he had learned about the nature of true artistry. In interviews, he would speak of Michael with a respect and affection that surprised many who had expected the rivalry to continue. He would say that Michael had taught him that greatness is not about being better than others but about using one's gifts in service of something larger than oneself, about touching hearts and healing wounds and creating connections that transcend the ordinary boundaries of human interaction. The performance that Michael and Prince created together that night was never officially released, though bootleg recordings would circulate among fans and collectors for decades. Those who heard these recordings spoke of them in hushed, reverent tones, describing music that seemed to exist outside of time, that captured something essential about the nature of collaboration and creativity. The two artists had proven that competition could be transformed into cooperation, that rivalry could give way to respect, that the greatest achievements often come not from individual triumph but from the willingness to create something together. Madison Square Garden would host thousands more concerts in the years that followed, but those who worked there would speak of that night as something special, something that stood apart from even the most successful shows. The energy that had filled the arena seemed to linger in the walls, in the seats, in the very air of the building, a residual charge that reminded everyone who entered of the transcendent possibilities of live performance. And in a glass case in a museum that would eventually be dedicated to Michael Jackson's life and legacy, a single white glove would be displayed with a small placard explaining its significance. But next to the case, another item would hang in a frame of its own, a handwritten letter from a young girl named Emily, the letter that had moved Michael Jackson to tears on a stage in front of 20,000 people, the letter that had reminded one of the world's most famous people of the simple human truths that connected all of us. The letter spoke of love and loss, of fear and hope, of a child's desperate need to believe that even in the face of death, something meaningful could remain. It spoke of what Michael's music had meant to Emily and her mother, how they would dance together in their small living room, how the songs had provided a soundtrack to their happiest memories. And it spoke of a wish, a simple request that Michael might somehow know about Emily and remember her, so that after her mother was gone, someone else in the world would know that they had existed and that they had mattered. Michael had kept his promise to remember. In the years that followed, he would send birthday cards to Emily, would check on her progress through the foundation he established to help children in difficult circumstances, would follow her journey with the quiet attention that characterized his most genuine relationships. When she graduated from college, a single white rose arrived with a card that contained just 2 words, "For Emily." When she opened her music therapy practice, a donation arrived that would ensure she could serve children regardless of their family's ability to pay. When she got married, a package arrived containing a photograph of Michael on stage that night, signed with words of blessing and love. And on the night that Prince passed away, decades after that legendary concert, Emily received a phone call from someone who had been part of Prince's inner circle. The caller explained that Prince had left specific instructions in his will, that among his most treasured possessions was a fedora that had been given to him on a stage in New York City, and that his wishes were for this hat to be returned to its rightful home. The fedora, the caller explained, should be given to a young woman named Emily, because Prince believed that she, more than anyone, would understand what it meant and would honor the legacy it represented. Emily, now a grown woman with children of her own, accepted the fedora with tears streaming down her face. She placed it in the case next to the glove, 2 iconic accessories that had once belonged to the 2 most famous musicians in the world, now united in the home of someone who had been given both as gestures of love and compassion. Her children would grow up with these artifacts on display, would hear the stories of that incredible night, would learn that even the most famous and successful people are ultimately defined not by their achievements but by their kindness. Tonight, as you watch this video, perhaps you carry your own burdens, your own fears, your own desperate hopes for something or someone that seems beyond your reach. Perhaps you feel small in a world that celebrates only the extraordinary, invisible in a culture that notices only the famous. But the story of that night in Madison Square Garden carries a message that remains as relevant today as it was then. Kindness matters. Compassion heals. The most important connections are often the ones between the mighty and the humble, the celebrated and the overlooked, the stars and those who gaze up at them from the darkness. Michael Jackson understood this truth in ways that few ever do. For all his fame, for all his talent, for all his success, he never forgot what it meant to be seen, to be valued, to be remembered. He gave his glove to a child because he recognized that in that moment, she needed something more than an autograph, more than a photo, more than a story to tell her friends. She needed to know that she mattered, that her pain was witnessed, that her love for her mother was honored and would be remembered. And in that simple act of giving, Michael created something that would outlast all his records, all his awards, all his spectacular performances. He created a legacy of compassion that continues to ripple outward through time, touching lives he never met, inspiring kindness in people who only knew him through his music and his legend. This is the true measure of greatness. Not the height of one's achievements, but the depth of one's impact on the hearts of others. The final image that those who were there would carry with them forever was not of Michael dancing or singing or performing any of the spectacular feats that had made him famous. It was of him kneeling beside a small child, listening to her story, treating her with the same respect and attention he might give to a head of state. It was of his bare hand, the hand that had worn the glove for so many years, reaching out to touch a child's face with a tenderness that transcended performance. It was of two people, separated by unimaginable gulfs of fame and circumstance, meeting in a moment of pure human connection that proved such connections are always possible, always available, always waiting for someone brave enough to reach across the divide. This is the story of that night. This is the story of a challenge answered with grace, of rivalry transformed into respect, of fame used in service of compassion. This is the story of Michael Jackson, not just as the king of pop, but as a human being capable of seeing other human beings even when the lights were brightest and the crowds were loudest. And this is the story of a little girl named Emily, who learned on a stage in front of 20,000 people that she was not alone, that she was loved, that she would be remembered. Thank you for watching, for being part of this community, for caring about these stories as much as we do. Please share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who needs to be reminded that kindness exists, that compassion is real, that even in a world that often seems dark and divided, moments of grace continue to occur. Like, subscribe, and join us as we continue to explore the extraordinary life of Michael Jackson, one story at a time.